Welcome, everybody. We are so glad that you are here with us today, both those of you who are in the room and also folks joining us online. Hi, people joining us online. We want to make sure we acknowledge you, and you have opportunities to ask questions too, so throw those in the chat. We are Sports at the Humanities Institute, where we explore what sports reveal about the social, economic, political, and cultural elements of society, as well as the complexities, contradictions, and liberations that get to the heart of the human experience, or what it means to be human. Another way to say this is that we like to look at the many ways humans make meaning out of sport. I'm Victoria Jackson. I'm one of 3 co-directors of Sports at HI, and we'd like to thank Curtis Austin and Victoria Day and Jake Leviton for their work and support to make this event and Sports at HI possible. You'll be hearing from co-director Terry Shoemaker in a bit, but I'd also like to thank Sean Klein, our other co-director, for his work too. If you look for it, connections between sport and religion are everywhere. Did I say my name? Okay, just wanted to make sure I did. If you look for it, connections between sport and religion are everywhere. Just today, Pablo Torre had Jane Coaston, who writes about politics and especially conservative movements for many outlets, including the New York Times, had Jane Coaston on his show, Pablo Torre Finds Out, to talk about college football and electoral politics. Trump was at the Alabama-Georgia game over the weekend, and Walz was at the Minnesota-Michigan game in Ann Arbor. So that was the context for their conversation. We have a VP debate tonight, and I bet football is going to come up there too. And there's a good 5 minutes or more of their conversation where Coaston and Torre talk about college football enabling the experience of the sublime. Coaston, who is a Michigan alum and a huge Michigan football fan, as am I, not an alum but a fan, talked about why her experience at the Rose Bowl in January when Michigan became national champions was the most sublime experience of her life, specifically when Roman Wilson caught the game-tying touchdown to send the national title game to overtime in Michigan's eventual win over Alabama. Metaphors to convey profound emotional or spiritual experiences with religious overtones are by no means the only way in which sports and religions are connected. And we're going to get to experience a deep dive in these connections this evening thanks to our 3 wonderful speakers. First, far away on my right is Tracy Fessenden, who will serve as our moderator. Tracy is the Steve and Margaret Forster Professor, there's a lot of R's in that, in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies, and Director of Strategic Initiatives in the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict. Tracy has authored and co-edited many books and book series, including most recently, Religion Around Billie Holiday. I hope that she doesn't mind me sharing this, but Tracy was also a college athlete. No, people know this, but Tracy was a college athlete. Second, Terry Shoemaker, to my immediate right, author of Religions and Sports, The Basics, one of the books we will be discussing today. Terry is a professor of religious studies in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies here at ASU, and co-director of Sports at HI. He is a qualitative research scholar focusing on religious change in contemporary life in the United States. This includes the ways that religion and religious people adapt, convert, deconvert, reform, and abandon aspects of their religiosity or spirituality. He also studies sports in the United States through the lens of religious studies, theories, and methods. And I also hope he doesn't mind me sharing this, but Terry was also a college athlete. Finally, our panelist who has traveled many thousands of miles to join us. And thank you so much for coming to Arizona State University despite our heat, which is continuing into October. Randall Balmer, author of the other book we will be discussing today, Passion Plays, How Religion Shapes Sports in North America. Randall holds the John Phillips Chair in Religion, the oldest endowed professorship at Dartmouth College. He is the author of more than a dozen books, and his commentaries appear in newspapers across the country. Randall is a prize-winning historian, an Emmy Award nominee, and is an Episcopal priest. This year, the American Academy of Religion honored him with the Marty Award for the public understanding of religion. I hope you enjoy the event and that you'll consider joining us 2 days from now on Thursday, October 3rd at 4 p.m. to hear from two of the world's leading scholars who will talk to us about the important power of listening. You can go on the Hughes Institute website to find out more about that event on Thursday. And please give our speakers a warm Sun Devil welcome.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for that introduction. Yes, I was a college athlete, very briefly. And here I am now, looking from the outside in. These books are very different. Randall Balmer's book is very conversational. It exemplifies what I've come to think of as writing from the academy, that is not just talking to other professors in the language that we speak, but writing from the academy with a wealth of acumen, of historical knowledge and experience to people who may or may not be in the academy, but who are interested in this question of religion and sports. Terry's book is classroom ready, and I am absolutely serious about this. I would give this as a gift to anyone who was writing job letters right now, because you have a class you can teach with this book, and you really can. I mean, Terry just takes you through each week of the semester practically, and it's brilliant. I wish I had taken this class. But very, so different, each a different scholarly voice, a different imagined audience, I think. But you're writing about something very similar, and that is the relationship between sports, or sport, I guess as we say here, sport, and religion. And so I just would like to open by asking you to say a little bit more about how you came to walk this path. Randall, you have a confession. You begin with a confession.
Yeah, I do.
That your name is Randall Balmer, and you are addicted to sports radio. And Terry, you tell a fascinating story about being in Baltimore and seeing this guy perform his devotions at the Memorial for Edgar Allan Poe in Baltimore. And the reason he's performing his devotions is because he is a Ravens fan. And if you didn't know, the Baltimore Ravens took their name from the Edgar Allan Poe poem. So I would just want to hear more from both of you. How did you come to this?
Oh, well, first of all, I feel like a bit like I'm an imposter here, because I'm in presence of people who really do study religion and sports, and I just kind of came in from the side. The book really has two creation stories, two Genesis stories. First and most immediately was that when I was teaching in New York, I became addicted to sports radio. WFAN was just coming on the air, the early years of sports radio. And I tuned in, and I was just fascinated that radio hosts could sustain a conversation for 4 hours on whether or not Joe Torre should have lifted the starting pitcher with 2 outs in the bottom of the 6th inning. And the passion that they brought to this conversation was, for me, just fascinating. Actually, and I noticed it again today on the plane. I was watching the coverage of the Middle East situation with the bombing by Iran of Israel, and the sober sort of analysis, and then somebody within my site was watching ESPN and a conversation about, I guess, the New York Jets or something like that. And again, the contrast, the animation and the passion that was being spilt on sports, again, over hour after hour after hour, just was fascinating to me. And I wanted to kind of look into it a little bit more. The deeper inspiration for the book was back in graduate school. I took much of my coursework in the history department at Princeton, and my main mentor there was a sports fan, and he used to talk about the real origins, of the real symbolism behind the major team sports in North America. He didn't talk about hockey, but he talked about baseball, in particular football and basketball. And I'd been kind of thinking about these ideas for 4 or 5 decades, and finally I decided to write a book about it. So my approach is very historical. And of course, Terry is much more accomplished in many things, but particularly in this topic of religion and sports. So I'll defer to him.
The fact that Randall Balmer would say that I am much more accomplished is maybe the most ridiculous statement I've heard all day long. For me to sit here talking with Professors Fessenden and Balmer, who are just so well known in the religious studies academic world and beyond, I'm the imposter on this panel, just so that we're all being truthful. In some ways, the religion and sports conversation, now when I look back on it, it seems obvious that I would be in the religion and sports studies. Growing up in the middle of nowhere, Kentucky, where you can throw a stone and hit a church anywhere you are. I'm not saying throw stones and hit a church, but you could. And then the basketball of UK fandom there. I mean, it was so obvious. But I have to say that I initially came into the conversation of religion and sports through my mentor and now colleague, Eric Bain-Selbo, who was at Western Kentucky at the time when I was doing my master's degree. And Professor Bain-Selbo, he is probably the leader in the conversation that sports in contemporary society constitute religiosity. And when he first told me that, I just started laughing. I was like, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And he said, why? And I was like, well, listen, like no one drives by a church and says, that's an awesome sports stadium. And no one drives by a sports stadium and says, that's an awesome church, right? Like we categorically, as humans, operate with two distinctive things. And so he and I we'd bicker for a while, all in good nature and everything else. But what happened was I published a paper, actually has nothing to do with sports at all. It's on interfaith activity, actually with Jamie Edmonds, who's in the audience. Yeah, I know. But we co-published a paper, I don't know, like 8 years ago or something now. And there was a theoretical kind of framework in it. And then this other paper that I did. And so Eric Bain-Selbo said, I want to apply that to religion and sports. He said, either I can cite you or you need to jump into this whole thing and you need to co-write it with me. And so that's what I did at the time. And I have to say that, and I won't recount the entire thing, but I had this experience in Baltimore, Maryland, actually at the American Academy of Religion conference, where, again, Eric Bain-Selbo and I went for a run and we ended up at the Edgar Allan Poe Memorial, which is at a now defunct church and graveyard, and it sets in the front because they relocated him and his remains, and I think the remains of his mother-in-law and his wife as well. And while I'm standing there, it's so cold that day. I mean, it's unbelievably cold. For Baltimore to consider canceling the game, that's how cold it is. And this guy jumps out of his car, leaves it running, runs up to the monument and just sits there almost in a prayerful kind of posture, drops something on the ground and runs back to his car. And I was like, what was that? And before I could even get over there, another car comes up, two guys jump out, they run up, do the same thing, and I realized they had dropped pennies. And this is, the whole monument was brought to the front through a Pennies for Poe campaign by kids back in the day. And so now it's become this ritual thing for Ravens fans to do. And I was like, so religion, right? The religion that I knew was now defunct and inoperable, but there's this other thing taking place on the grounds. And so that's really what compelled me. I was like, okay, so maybe there's something to this. And I really wanted to dive in at that point.
Terry, you cite, I think it's Johann Weizsäcker, who invokes the idea of play, and that seemed particularly resonant for me as a framework for thinking about the relationship between religion and sport. Play precedes both, in his view, right? That before we had anything like religions, before we had anything like sports with rules and teams and allegiances and so on, we humans played. We knew how to play, or we figured out that this was healthy and good, and it was something that made us human, right? And so it seems to me that this, again, is a very resonant sort of rubric or framework for thinking about the connections between religion and sport. For both, the game is deadly serious, right? Deeply passionate, and yet the spoils or stakes for fans are intangible, right? I mean, what are they? It's different in that way from business or war or gambling. One side doesn't leave the game with the other's land or wealth, or one side isn't installed as ruler over the other, over the losing side, right? Nothing is settled, except the winner, according to the rules that both agree on in advance. So I'm finding this a place where we might want to think more deeply, say a little bit more, particularly as we might look to sports to make our politics or our religions less toxic. I think it was Bart Giamatti, who was my college president before he became commissioner of baseball.
Yeah.
He said sports is a civil surrogate along with politics for people ever in need of a covenant, meaning like our religious ideas of covenant are failing us, so we turn to sports and religion. And yet we turn to sports and politics. But politics is about, the spoils are different, right? The stakes are different. And the game is the game. And the game has no, like religion, I mean, it has no object except what our imaginations put forward or project as the object. So is it worth thinking more about this, or reflecting more on this?
Oh, it's definitely worth. I think. I mean, seriously, I think play gets at, and I mentioned this in the book, but more on a way to kind of explore this idea for the reader. One of the things that's striking in Huizinga's work is this idea that play precedes everything, which is really, really interesting to think about. So for a lot of people, the idea is that humans need to hunt food or whatever, and they invent a spear, and then they realize when they're not hunting, they can toss that thing and make a game out of it. But for this scholar, it's totally different. It's that humans were playing around with a stick and made a game and said, we could use that as a spear, right? So for him, play begets everything. And it's really, really interesting, and I mentioned this in the book in the sense that like, when we think of religions, at least how we inherit them today, they seem to be so serious, right? There's so much involved, and there's so much at stake, and they're tied to our politics and everything else. But if we look culturally and historically at religions, there seems to be a lot of playfulness embedded in it. A lot of the original stories about the gods with thunder and creation stories, like I mentioned a couple of African narratives that are so comical. And so like one of the things I keep trying to stress for my religion and sports and play colleagues at the American Academy of Religion is that we ought to do a call for religion as play, and everybody always pushes back and says, oh my gosh, everybody would attack us for that. And I say, well, who cares? One, but if we're actually getting at something, then there's a substance we've missed because it's all so taken so heavily now, and we miss the playful part of it. And interestingly, I'm personally all for athletes making political statements and stadiums and whatever they need to do. But the one part of it for me that I sometimes think that when an athlete does make a political statement, I always think like, oh man, are you ruining something about the playfulness of the moment by bringing politics into it? I'm not fully there yet, but I definitely think play gets to what it means to be human, and that's a segue into thinking more about religion and sport, although we miss that a lot of times.
But there's also a sense of escape, I think. And one of the ideas that I was trying to work with is that I think that the explosion of interest and fanaticism around sports over the last several decades, and I've seen it in my lifetime. Part of it is sports radio, but I think sports radio is kind of a bellwether for larger sentiments. But one of the arguments I try to make is that sports fandom appeals, I think, disproportionately to white male fans. And I began to think about that, and it seems to me what sports offers is an orderly universe. You think about sports fields. Most of the angles are rectangular, right? There are very clear boundaries, so something that is either inbounds or it's out of bounds. It's either fair or foul. You're either safe or out. Especially these days with video review, you really get it right. And I think part of the attraction is this escapism from the perception of the larger world. And I want to emphasize that for white males, it's perception more than reality. That is, the perception these days is that life is unfair. We are not able to compete on the level playing field, which is another metaphor we use to talk about sports. The odds are against us. Everything is stacked against us, whether it's affirmative action or whatever it might be. And I think part of the reason for the huge spike of interest in sports and athletics is that it offers an escape to an orderly universe where something's either fair or it's foul. The example I use sometimes is that, if the batter is up at bat and he takes strike 3, he doesn't turn to the umpire and say, I've had a bad day. My sister was just diagnosed with cancer. I didn't sleep well. Give me another strike. You just don't do that, right? You play within a recognized field in terms of boundaries, but also with agreed upon rules. And these are immutable. And I think it's this orderly universe, very much different from the perception on the part of white males about how they're somehow disadvantaged in the larger society.
I want to come back to that, and I will shortly, because the flip side to that is that if the batter, if the player at bat is from the Dominican Republic and he hits a home run, you don't say DEI.
Yeah.
Like the rules are the rules.
Right, exactly.
And of course, the argument which is very compelling to me is that the reason why sports are so much, sports are much more racially integrated than other areas of society is because the playing field is level, right?
I think it's the closest we have
at
to a
least more
perfect
level.
meritocracy.
Yeah.
And you have to account for the fact that some people are better able to play and compete in sports because of economic advantages and so forth. But the fact remains that at least at the collegiate and the professional levels, if you're not good, you're not going to play, right?
Yeah,
So it's a meritocracy.
There's no such thing as an affirmative action homework, I don't think.
Right.
But we'll come back to that. I want to follow up on this notion of play because you each speak of religion and sports as relatively discrete domains, and Terry, your book does this visually. Each chapter has the religion bubble, the sports bubble, and they shoot arrows at each other, or they borrow from each other, or sometimes they become identified, move closer to each other, but they are these discrete entities. Randy, you talk about sort of these religious examples as sort of precursor types. The talk radio is like the confessional. You go in and you say how long it's been since,
Right.
since you've had this conversation.
First time, long time.
First time, long time. The Baseball Hall of Fame is like a cathedral. The rule book is like the Pillars of Islam or the Ten Commandments. So religion is sort of there, as the strong type, and then the religious riffs on that are being kind of religion-like, right? But if we think of both religion and sports as forms of play, does one really have that relationship to the other, the sort of informing, licensing, shaping, or could we think of a different kind of relationship? Is there something maybe more complex and generative about the shared attributes of these two forms of life if we think of them both as forms of play and not as here's the religious original, here's the religious, here's the the copy in the world of sports. Because I like to think of, religions are also made, right?
Sure.
They're also created.
Sure.
They're also games.
Yeah.
And so can sports help us think that way? Maybe loosen up our thinking about religion a little bit. And I don't know, but it just seems that there's more going on than one stamping the mold and the other.
Yeah, I probably want to defer to Terry on that. Because he's thought more about this than I have. That's an interesting.
So I think this is a great way to come at it. And one of my critiques of when people do, when scholars do religion and sports, what they mean typically, and by typically I mean almost always, is they will take the constitutive parts of religion, almost like an Indian smart kind of thing, right? And then break it down and say, look, sports has all of these things, and let's look at all the family resemblances, right? And that's typically the way, I think Eric Bain-Sebo and Greg Sapp, their entire book is constructed that way. I think they actually use smarts. Religion has rituals, and look at all these sporting rituals, therefore these two things are alike, kind of. And I've been somewhat critical of that for the reasons that you're getting at, that it's, no one ever, at least most of what I've seen, no one ever then says, well, then what's the elements of sport, which you're talking about, right? The parameters, the boundaries, the rule making, and then says, well, now religion is like sport, right? Mm-hmm. So there is the argument that religion's, what I call in the book, religion as sport, but rarely ever do you, sport as religion, but rarely ever do you see religion as sport. Right. Is kind of the inverse, which is like what I'm trying to push people towards more thinking about, that if we start thinking about like a lot of what we do, a lot of our human ventures as playfulness, then it opens up a window where we don't take two categories, we actually start bringing in all kinds of, you could start thinking about our capitalist pursuits as a form of play. And again, finances brings a whole nother level of seriousness to it as well. One of the things that I've been trying to do in the studies that I've conducted, a lot of the religion and sports work is done thinking about fandom or thinking about the big revenue generating sports of baseball, basketball, hockey, football. And there's not a lot done with amateur sports. Yeah. And so this is really where I'm trying to kind of wiggle into. So, and I'll give you, for instance, as it comes to this, which is to your point, so I did a study with skateboarders, and then I did a study with pickleball players. Two separate studies because they don't intermingle typically. But in each case, I would ask, like the skateboarders, I would say something to the effect of, this was actually the second question. The first question I would ask would be something like, what's it like when you skate? Like, just tell me, what's going through your mind? What are you feeling? And oh my gosh, the riffs of just, oh my gosh, when I skate, gets back to the escapist thing, right? Like, I just get away from they didn't say it this way, but all the predetermined parts of life, right? But then they would say something like, oh my gosh, I'm just in a meditative state when I'm on that board. And I'll just land a trick, and I don't even realize I've landed the trick, Or they'd say, I'm in a flow state. Or they would use the word transcend every now and again, right? And then I would say, so is it spiritual for you? And they'd say, oh, hell no, right? And I would just kind of chuckle to myself, right? And then the pickleball players, we actually did a fairly large survey sample with pickleball players in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and on Bainbridge Island, where the sport was created. And when I asked the question, so what is pickleball to you? And people would say, oh my gosh, the community connections, the deep relations I have. And then they would say, when I'm on that court, nothing else matters. It's almost like I'm in a meditative, transcendent flow state zone. And then the next question was, do you think of pickleball as being spiritual or religious? And people were literally like, what's wrong with you? I'm not going to answer any more questions. This is dumb, right? And so, it's interesting that the person on the street, the amateur athlete, when you try to blur these two things, they categorically know there's two different kind of things going on. But when they describe these things, it's like, no, there is something going on that our moment, especially I think in a society that is so stressed out with our bifurcation and religions and politics and blah, 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 to be able to play for a while. There's something really special about it at this moment. And I'm hoping this eventually leads me to getting more into that human meaning making that Victoria was talking about. And I'm hoping eventually people will recognize maybe I should bring that playfulness into my politics and into my religion and everything else to try to almost course correct some of the negative things we're doing in these spaces.
Do you think that explains the decline of, say, for example, mainline Protestantism or Catholicism as opposed to megachurch evangelicalism? That is to say, megachurch evangelicalism strikes me as entertainment, right? Is that what's going on?
So obviously that occurs at that transition happens, a Vietnam response, and there's a whole kind of history there. But interestingly, I actually think that what evangelicalism is doing with its political ties right now may be that too rigid kind of thing. And what I've seen in some mainline churches is that the Presbyterian church I was telling you that I taught at, they had I don't know if everyone does, I actually have no idea, but they had a Sunday where you would bring your pets and they would do a blessing of everyone's pets. That's kind of a playfulness and a recognition that there's something there, right? And they did, the Episcopal Church had a Eucharist, where the whole Eucharist only utilized U2 songs. And they had a slam poet give the sermon that day. And so I think there actually is some playfulness in the mainline churches. I just think there's some foreignness to some of the mainline liturgy and everything now that maybe doesn't make them as marketable as at the moment.
Both of you talk about race and gender in your analysis. But Randy, much more than Terry, and here's where your books I think are very different. You make it pretty clear that your book is about white men, right? I mean, that
In terms of the fandom, yes.
That you are interested in how for white men sports has become a kind of surrogate for religion and a refuge. So, and we talked a little bit about a refuge from what? In part, a refuge from a world in which white men might perceive themselves to be decentered, right? You also look at some ways in which that sports provides a corrective in maybe recentering the power of white men. When white fans cheer for black players, it might be because they regard them as the entertainment, right? Or that there's a gladiatorial element. You are going to bleed and get your head banged for me, for my entertainment, right? Terry, you include a list of parallel toxicities in sports and religion. The sports list begins brain trauma, doping, steroids, human growth hormones, racist mascots, gender inequality, domestic violence by players. And then you line that up with the Catholic Church pedophilia scandal, sexual abuse, LGBTQ exclusion, et cetera, et cetera. So in some respects, hierarchies that some white men wish were even more entrenched outside the sports arena do obtain inside the arena and might get energy from being centered there. And yet, it remains the case that when one side wins in the sports arena, the losing side does not rush the field, destroy the stadium, and build a gallows to hang the referee who might have gone rogue and called a different result that didn't. So what is reassuring, these are Randy's words, what is reassuring and enchanted about the sports arena is that the rules are fair, and both sides insist on this, right? Both sides insist that the rules are fair. Our politics and our religion, particularly those where white men form the majority of the adherents, insist on being centered, have become in this way decidedly unsportsmanlike. So, plenty of folks lament that politics has become like sports, and perhaps that's true insofar as we lose sight of the real stakes, right? We're just cheering for our team. And yet it also has become unsportsmanlike, right? The idea that you don't change the rules in the middle of the game, you don't, call for the ref to be hanged. So is there hope, is my question. If sports is a refuge for white men who feel decentered beyond the arena, could their sports fandom feed some sense into their ways of operating in other domains, right? Politics, religion, where you can bend the rules. I mean, one of the things, when you were saying that, here's one of your examples of type and copy, the rules for football are like, the Ten Commandments. Well, people break the Ten Commandments all the time. But you can't break the rules for football and still play football, right? You can't. So the rules really are more binding, and yet there's a playfulness, right? So, could fandom be a good thing for folks who might be losing sight of the importance of playing by the rules or honoring, the need for a loser in every competition?
I'm not sure I'm answering your question, Tracy, but it strikes me that in terms of race, athletics really has, in many ways, shown the way for social change. The example I usually cite is Jackie Robinson broke the color line in Major League Baseball on April 15th, 1947. Harry Truman desegregated the armed forces just over a year later. So there's an example where racial inclusion in sports prefigured the tumbling of a much larger barrier. And I think that, these white fans that I'm talking about cheering so lustily for athletes of color, I guess I find some hope in that. But there's an underside to it as well, as we saw with Colin Kaepernick, right? Once he gets out of his lane, he's done. I think Colin Kaepernick has to be numbered as one of the martyrs of our time, giving up his very lucrative football career, and not only lucrative, but something he really wanted to do, standing for a larger principle. So when one hand giveth, I think the other hand taketh away in some ways. Both in the book and in the course I teach on sports and religion, I end with, or toward the end of the course, I have the students read the first chapter of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which is very powerful. We talk about white spectators and combatants of color in that arena, and with all of the description that Ellison brings to that scene, I think it's very, very powerful. And that I think is what's going on, I think, in a lot of these athletic events. As you say, subsidizing this sort of gladiatorial combat, which is, it's even more evident in these fighting matches that they do now on television, which is just, I can't watch this, it's just too brutal, too violent, but it's even more evident there, it seems to me.
I see something very similar with music from that period, right? I mean, there was a feeling on the part of the State Department that we need to send these black jazz artists, into the former colonies of Europe to show that we are not who the Soviet Union says we are. We're not racist jerks. We do have an incredible culture that is, an incredible musical culture centered on black performance. But of course, at home, these black performers couldn't, buy a Coke. Right. And so somehow that had to be undone by the black performers themselves. It was Armstrong who said, well, I'll go if you, Eisenhower, send troops to Little Rock, and get your act together, and then I'll go and tell the world, how great America's doing. So there's yes, there's a sense, Armstrong especially, a sense in which he played the performer, right? And yet did incredible things. And I think the sports figures are similar, are doing a similar service, I think, for democracy.
And I think, and I made this point, and Terry made the point nicely too. I think we've reached a point where moral guidance in our society is coming from athletes more often than from religious leaders. We used to look to people like Martin Luther King Jr., but also Reinhold Niebuhr, Abraham Joshua Heschel, and other leaders.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Even Billy Graham?
Billy Graham, certainly, for moral guidance. And those voices, I mean, there's nothing really in them, maybe Cornel West, but beyond that, who is offering a prophetic voice? LeBron James, Colin Kaepernick. I mean, this is where we're looking now for moral leadership.
Well, and I'll just add to that to bring in the gender issue, Victoria, for you. And I bring it up in the book as well, that women have always had to fight for their place in spaces, right? And I think there's the pioneers who get in, but then there's the pioneers who work so that everybody else will then take women seriously, right? It's almost like the second wave has to happen after that. And I'll say that two things. One, I think, the WNBA has kind of been that not taken seriously thing until very recently, right? And there's maybe some racialized stuff we could talk about with that as well. But there's starting to be taken seriously as basketball athletes. But then the other thing is to get to, this is, I think, where both of our books overlap, is the prophetic voice. And I even have a book called The Prophetic Dimension of Sport that looks at this. And when I started researching this, it's really interesting to see how there were female athlete predecessors to the Colin Kaepernick, to some of the other ones who were standing up, who didn't get the notoriety, but who inspired LeBron James and Chris Paul and Carmelo Anthony to stand up in the NBA. And there's this fantastic story of a college basketball player, I think in Missouri, who ends up during they're announcing the rosters for the teams. During the national anthem, she actually walks over to the American flag. So this is a college basketball game, not heavily attended, and walks over to the American flag and lays on the floor for 4.5 minutes in front of the flag, representing the 4.5 hours that is it Michael Brown shot in Ferguson. This is like right, and she ends up like the school wants to kick her out, but then everybody says you can't kick her out, and so it's like she has this great story, and she's kind of this first like a Bruggemanian kind of prophetic witness that's occurring, and it's the WNBA teams who are literally like, it's not even kneeling. We're not even going to come out during the national anthem to prove a point. We're not even going to talk to the media to prove a point. We're going to put everybody's names on our warm-up shirts. Like they're making like really like just straightforward things, and the players are doing great. The male players are doing wonderful too, but the WNBA players are doing something totally different at a different level. And so it's the WNBA, I think, is a great example of like women leading. Not only basketball, but leading how to be a professional athlete with a social justice-oriented voice, and using your position to speak truth to power as well.
Terry, I think you include the statistic that the average salary for an NBA player, a male player, is $6.4 million. The average salary for a WNBA player is $71,000. Teacher salary. Clearly, the scales have not been balanced. However, it is the case, I think I just looked this up, that 27% of Major League Baseball players are not American. They are immigrants, and that's a low. It's usually much higher than that. There's far more racial and religious diversity in professional sports than in, say, Congress or in the list of U.S. presidents. So what are the lessons here? And we talked about this a little bit, that sports is a meritocracy, but it's also sort of a democracy. I think of ways that people, kids all over the world playing soccer in, very, very desperate conditions, but soccer is sort of a way out. Soccer is a way to something else. Notre Dame, invests in its football team so that Catholics can get a leg up in society. I mean, sports has been seen as sort of a ladder of some kind, which has worked better than lots of others.
Yeah.
So what are the, if we think about sports and democracy, is sport an engine of democracy, even with these obscene salary disparities, or is it just because it's a meritocracy that everyone who's good, whatever your color, whatever your religion, can make the big time?
I'll respond just quickly with a brief personal anecdote. So growing up kind of in the middle of what I say, I grew up in Tuckasee, that borderline between Kentucky and Tennessee, and grew both my teenage parents, and they had me and an identical twin. No high school education, and we were poor. We were super poor, and their families, just kind of the poverty level people. And honestly, the talk for us was always, like what factory, graduate high school, and then what factory are you going to work at, was kind of the mentality growing up. But in high school, I was playing a game of pickup basketball, and the high school coach just happened to see me, and he said, "How come you're not playing on the team?" And I said, "Well, I work part-time," and he's like, we can make it happen. And as soon as I was on the basketball team, all of a sudden, there were different cultural opportunities for me. There was a whole, and I mean, I'm a white guy in Kentucky, right? And all my, particularly my black peers who were on the basketball team would always just talk about, man, we get to eat here and we get to have this dinner, and these boosters are coming in and like buying stuff for us and everything else. And I was like, man, this is, and so I don't know, it does seem to be a ladder for opportunity for a lot of people. And I have to say that honestly, it was that honestly gave me the confidence to then pursue other things. I ended up in the Navy and playing on a travel basketball team in the Navy. And that was what gave me the confidence to move up. And so it was through basketball that I actually learned kind of who I am and who I could be in a lot of ways that culturally I wasn't given the confidence to be who I was.
Can I do my little riff on baseball?
Yeah.
In terms of opportunity? I think baseball in particular has always been a game that has featured the talents of immigrants. Going back to the 19th century, it was immigrants from Europe, even in some of the names, Dutch and nicknames and so forth. And then, of course, the breaking of the color line with Jackie Robinson, and then more recently, players from the Dominican Republic in particular, now Asian players. So immigrants have always excelled at baseball. But baseball, I argue, is actually an immigrant game, because it's the only game where the defense controls the ball. And it's the object of the offensive player to disrupt the defense's control of the ball. It's so difficult. He's outnumbered 9-1, first of all. And it's so difficult to do that if he fails 7 times out of 10, he'll go to the Hall of Fame. There are 3 islands of safety out in that hostile territory, and the greatest triumph is to return home. So baseball itself, I think, symbolizes the whole immigrant experience. And it's one of my favorite photographs in the book. I found at the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. It shows Jackie Robinson, I forgot a Jewish player from the New York Giants, I've forgotten his name, and Joe DiMaggio from the Yankees, all together in a photograph. 3 New York teams at that time, of course. One of them African American, 1 Jewish, and 1 Italian American. It kind of captures perfectly what baseball offered to each of them.
I was going to ask you before opening this up to the audience, you both have such wonderful stories in these books. So if you just want to share a favorite vignette or favorite anecdote, Terry, do you want to? What's your favorite story that you got to tell?
The Raven story is my favorite. Is
I
my
love that he puts it, this is a freezing cold day, and the guy puts his Ravens jersey on over his coat.
Yeah, his jersey's so big. I mean, it's like a big puffer jacket, and it's just over the top. I think the Raven story really does. I think because it was so like pivotal for me and my thinking to reconsider what I was doing with my religious studies research was probably the one. Interestingly, a fun part of the book, and I didn't dive super deeply into this, but I think it would be a project, is actually looking at athletes who write religious autobiographies after they retire. And so like I don't know why. Kentucky has no professional sports teams, and so like you get to pick whoever you want, kind of. So I was always a Mets fan in the 80s. I didn't know they were all doing cocaine at the time, but but I was a Darryl Strawberry fan, and I was a right-handed batter and taught myself to bat left-handed like Darryl Strawberry because he had such an unusual stance. And I remember the first time I got up to bat left-handed and I was playing coach pitch. And my dad's like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "Trust it." And I ended up hitting. He's like, "When did you learn that?" And I was like, "Darryl Strawberry." But Darryl Strawberry ended up, after his career and drug abuse and everything else, kind of had a religious conversion, wrote a story. Tim Tebow, Hakeem Olajuwon. And so like I was like, man, there's like this rich kind of repertoire of these things that no one's really like theorized what's going on here. And I think that was one of the really interesting things that I was like, gosh, this should be a project.
Yeah. I grew up reading collections of stories, profiles of athletes by James Heffley. Did you ever read those? And these were Christian, evangelical athletes, and he would write about their athletic prowess, but then talk about their faith, and he had a series of these books. A story, sad story. I guess probably one of the saddest stories is I'm going to forget his name here. I've been up since 12:30.
Yeah.
So I apologize. Johnny Bright, quarterback for the Drake University Bulldogs, and African American. He was going into his senior year. He had led the NCAA in rushing the season before. Going into his senior year, the Drake University Bulldogs went to Stillwater, Oklahoma, to play what is now Oklahoma State University. It's called something different then, I forgot what it was. And all week, the coach and the players of Oklahoma State were primed to stop Johnny Bright. First 4 plays of the game, the team captain, who was a defensive lineman, crashed into Johnny Bright after he had handed off the ball and was watching the play. The final blow broke his jaw and destroyed his season. He was a favorite for the Heisman Trophy. And adding insult to injury, the station master in Stillwater, Oklahoma, refused to allow Johnny Bright to board the same train car as his teammates for the trip back to Des Moines after the game. So that probably would be my favorite story.
Is there a more uplifting story?
Sure. Well, let me talk about. I'll finish baseball. Baseball, I think, is really so rich in symbolism. But what we have to recall about baseball is that it really took its shape during the Industrial Revolution. But it was countercultural because it rejected the icon of industrialism, which is the clock. It's the only game, of the 4 major team sports, only game that's not governed by a clock. And if you think about how the base runner runs the bases, he does so counterclockwise, as though to subvert the passage of time.
Interesting.
And that's what baseball is trying to do. And it's one of the reasons that baseball is in such trouble right now,
Yeah.
because it's not keeping up
Mhm.
with the modern demands of time.
Well, and I've often thought that Americans love sports where they get to manage time,
Yeah.
right? It always comes down to the last
Yeah.
few minutes, and what's more American than clock watching? So it's another way baseball's in trouble.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
I think we have time for questions.
So I haven't read either of your books, but do you talk about how coaches and star players are almost worshipped as idols? You have John Wooden with his pyramid, Pat Summitt with her rules for life, and then you have the Ten Commandments. So are there similarities between coaches and then how they're kind of looked up to and worshipped?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think this, if you're interested, Eric Bain-Sebo and Greg Sapp book, Understanding Sport as Religious Phenomena, I think they talk about this directly. And because Eric did it, I avoided it because, no, I'm joking. But it's interesting you bring up Pat Summitt, because I was at the University of Tennessee giving a talk earlier this year, and I can't think of another female that would have a statue memorializing her athletics on any campus across the country.
Asia Wilson.
Does she have one?
Yeah, Asia.
Oh, I didn't even know. But when I saw that Pat Summitt statue so prominent on the campus, it hit me so hard. I was like, oh my, is she the only one that? And obviously she's done so much for women's basketball, specifically at Tennessee, but then in general. But yeah, I mean, obviously, again, if you do the thing where you talk about sports as religion, and you take the parts of religion, right, and you talk about saints or idols or whatever, then obviously it's easy to kind of make those associations, I think, particularly with Lombardi and the big names, right, that were so instrumental in the sports. And even they were so good at what they did in coaching that it actually promoted the sport itself. Yeah.
It feels, I think at the professional and collegiate level, sports are very much kind of in flux right now. I think at both levels, like something like sports gambling that's been widely legalized online, and at the collegiate level, something like NIL. And then I think Dr. Fessenden, like your point is that people don't break the Ten Commandments, but they follow the rules of sports. But I think something like the Houston Astros, or recently with like Michigan football and its cheating scandal. I guess how do these changes and maybe these occasional disruptions, how does that impact? How do y'all imagine that impacts this kind of image of sport as escape? Does it collapse that escape? Especially, I imagine sports gambling. How does that change it from being an escape to maybe just something else entirely?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to respond to the gambling thing, but the idea of cheating, I think that's baseball fans take that very, very seriously. And again, I think it's because it violates this alternate universe that they have constructed. So when Tom Brady has the underinflated footballs, example I use in the book, I mean, again, sports radio just went berserk with this stuff. And I mean, not just all afternoon, but for weeks and weeks and weeks, because it violated that sense of the orderly universe that was separate from the real world. So I think that's and nothing enrages a sports fan more than a blown call from an official.
Oh, yes.
I mean, because again, that violates that orderly. I'm guessing you're a baseball fan.
I lived in Boston.
Oh, okay.
I'm more of a softball fan, but
okay.
I'm from Oklahoma, so I'm biased.
I would say that's a really good question, and I would say that one, Pete Rose, who just passed away, is, I mean, talk about destroying your legacy, right, with cheating.
Yeah. Or saints and sinners.
Yeah, disobeying the rule. He was just never forgiven, kind of. So no matter where you stand on the NIL or where you stood before, it was actually passed or whatever, and then where you stand on the sports gambling as well, one of the things that I think, the fact that those debates took so long to get passed and legalized in the forms we know them today, are people trying to protect what they think is the purity of the sport. Yeah. You know, especially the sports gambling, I think. The NIL, I think, has all kinds of other ramifications of exploitation and everything else. But the gambling, I think, is a really interesting example where I think a lot of people simply couldn't articulate why they're against it. But there's just something about, like, no, you would end up corrupting something that's pure. And again, there's all kinds of issues in sports. I'm not a sports as purist kind of thing, but I think for a lot of fans, there's something really, really pure about, sacred, about their sport, and to gamble on it is like to taint the entire sport. And then obviously a lot of people disagree with me because they're cashing in on it or whatever. But I think the people, in much the same way people would defend their religion, you kind of find apologists for their sport when it comes to issues like this.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think you just kind of touched on it, made me think of live golf too, and then also the argument of like bringing in foreign money to things like the NFL. And I think that the live golf example is a good example of like the predominantly male white fan base of golf having a really strong reaction to change or whatever that is coming in that's different that they know of. But there's also an argument to things being right or wrong or good for society. So how do you see that line, or what do you think is the best way to kind of attack an argument around, hey, well, some things are just not good for our country or investments, but then some things are maybe just you being afraid of change or adapting.
Well, I think it probably gets back to the purity thing, and the fear that there was something tainted about that association that somehow would violate the purity of the sport. That would be my guess in something like that. It's not something I followed very closely, I have to say.
Yeah, I'm not much of a golf enthusiast either. I mean, I know what you're talking about. A word that I would use that I mean something totally different is than the religious usage of this word is possession. Like, people think that their sports are theirs, right? And it's an imaginary, right? But to think about an outsider owning their sport or investing, I think hits people the wrong, and it gets back to the white male privilege and ownership and blah, 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 blah as well. But I think for a lot of sports fans, that's their team. That's their athlete. That's their guy. And to think that there's some there's always external money coming in to all of these revenue generating sports. But I think for the average fan, when they just get news of, it just takes away something from them.
Well, you hear this in sports radio too. They'll say, "Do you think we should go out and trade for a relief pitcher?" We as if as if the fan is deciding whether or not to make the trade.
Well, I mean, and like I always, again, I've had this conversation with Victoria because, as far as I know, no one in my family ever went to college, like ever, until I went to college. And so, like, the college sports never quite made sense to me. Growing up in Kentucky, where so many people are University of Kentucky basketball fans, but never went to that school, which was always like this strange disconnect for me. But I was always astounded that when I would watch the basketball game, the fans would always, like, I remember I had this, there was a woman, I think she was in her 70s watching the game, and she would watch the game and she would be like, "Oh, come on, Malik, what are you doing?" And I was like, she's talking to him, one, like he can hear her, and two, like she knows this guy, right? And that gets to, like, there's a real connection in their imagination between them and this team. And so I think there is something about the way that the fan sees themselves in relationship to the team that they get defensive about those things.
Sally, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much for this conversation. It's really interesting. It raises a lot of other questions. and I might just be cynical, but I'm hearing you say, and I hadn't thought this through before, that in some ways the sports fans' connection with the team is a fantasy. You just described some of the elements of that. And I'm wondering if one of the connections between sports and religion is that religion is sort of a fantasy, right? I mean, you have the story, you have what some people would call a myth, you have invisible forces that you can't see but you believe in very strongly. You feel very connected. Christianity is a lot about that, right? Connecting with Jesus and feeling like that's a personal connection. And so I'm interested in what you might think about that, and also the use of religion in sport. All the high school teams that pray before game. There's a lot of controversy in some places. You know, it's required, and the players have to go through it. It's it can be a problem. There was a wonderful cartoon in a recent New Yorker, I don't know if you saw it, where there's a football huddle, and the captain stands up and he says, "Oh no, the other team is praying too."
Yeah.
And this idea that God is connected with the way the team is. I wonder if you have any thoughts along those lines that you would share.
Well, I mean, that certainly happens. The idea of trying to cloak your team in some sort of divine mantle, sure. You know, years ago I did a story for Sojourners magazine, a cover story actually called "Is God a Rams Fan?" Right? You know, I think I probably said no, not necessarily, but there is sure there's a lot of that, and it's again a projection onto an athletic team, I suppose similar to ways religious folks would project onto a deity. Sure.
I think that's why prayer is so common on the field,
Yes,
because
right.
it's so similar. Like your lady who says, "Come on, what are you doing out there?" Like thinking she has a direct line to the coach, and she might talk to Jesus too in that way.
Yeah.
And it's very, it's very real.
Yeah, one of my students, so I teach religion in sports, and one of my students actually shared with me a picture that she snuck and took, but at her grandparents' house in New England. They're super Patriots fans. The grandma actually had a room built onto the house, and originally it was a sunroom, and then they walled it in, and she just knew she wasn't allowed in there. And so, one, she was a little afraid of what's in there, but she snuck in there one day, and it was actually a room, and she says there was an altar in there on one side, and there was like a Catholic cross, crucifix. And on the other side, there was another altar, and it had all Patriots memorabilia. And I was like, so she could just like go from side to side, and she was like, yeah, that's I was like, that's amazing.
The Holy of Holies.
Yeah, that she had built for herself. And so, I mean, I think one student told me that she was an off-season Christian. And I was like, what do you mean? And she was like, well, when football season's in, we're at the Cardinals Stadium every Sunday. And she's like, and when the season's done, we go to church. So I think there is some trading going on for some people. You know, it's not an either or for some people, for sure. And then to get to your other question about the prayers, one, I think you see prayers, the more violent the sport, the more you see prayers, right? I think there's a correlation there. I did an interview with Hamza Abdullah, who was a retired NFL player, and he's Muslim. And he had a really interesting take on the team prayer. So, you know, there's a whole Supreme Court case where they just allowed a public high school coach to lead a prayer. And there's all kinds of questions about this, right, about religious promotion and everything else. Hamza, when I asked him about it, he went to a Catholic high school in California, and he said you're on the bus, and you always, when everybody was on the bus, they all recited the Lord's Prayer together. And I said, well, you know, as a Muslim, what did you think? And he was like, oh, at that moment, I'm not a Muslim, I'm a football player. And he was like, that wasn't a Christian prayer, that wasn't a Muslim prayer, that was a prayer for our team. And he was like, so at the ending, I changed it a little bit in my mind. And he was like, but that was a team prayer, that's not a Christian. And I was like, that's phenomenal, like I'd never considered that. So I think, you know, like there is a difference for us thinking about this theoretically and legally and everything else versus how the actual athlete thinks about it as well.
Yes, Devin.
Thank you. This has been great. I'm obsessed with this. I love talking about all of this stuff. And I think it really connects into it really functions as like a mirror, I think, to the trials and tribulations of American history, particularly when we were talking about, or when y'all were talking about, like the way that white fans view these black players. And it made me think in my Civil War historian brain, like with horse racing, post-Civil War and Reconstruction with black jockeys and the way that they were just absolutely valorized, people like Isaac Murphy and stuff like that. And so it was a way for these white Southerners to process, like, looking at this changing view of black Americans and that, do these people have citizenship? What does that mean? But when we go into the Kentucky Derby, they're still going to be on the horses. They're still going to be the slave drivers, or the drivers that are enslaved people. It's going to function the same way. And so I'm just wondering, it's like, is the way that we, like white fans, kind of deify these black players now, is that still being used, do you think, as like this process for understanding the difficulties within society? That like it is something that allows people to kind of make these transitions. I don't know if this makes sense, but like it like came to my mind as well with like the minstrel shows, kind of in the early 20th century. Like, you know, politics were changing, but when you go into these shows, the rules were still the same as they were in the past. I guess that's the connect.
Yeah.
I guess to think about the University of Alabama football team. The last all-white team to be a national champion. And Bear Bryant, toward the end of the 1970s, was losing games. And particularly a game against USC, when Sam Bam Cunningham ran all over the Alabama team, and they lost. And afterwards, Bear Bryant turned around and said, I'm going to recruit black. Before that, he had said, we tried to recruit black players in Alabama, but we couldn't find anybody who was eligible. No, who could make.
Yeah.
But, you know, the necessity to become a winning coach again, which he did, once black players were admitted on the team, you know, that made all the difference. And I compare him in the book to George Wallace. They were contemporaries.
Yeah.
And of course, George Wallace was an unrelenting segregationist and remained so, at least to the end of his life. And you speculate about how Bear Bryant could have really, by the 1970s, he was a demigod in Alabama. And if he had shown some leadership on issues of race relations before finally allowing blacks onto the team, he would have been a powerful force for social change, I think. But, you know, once these black players came out of the team and they started winning, you know, then no problem for, I think, most of the fans anyway.
So I think there's still issues with kind of what we'd call like the white male gaze, and right. So I'm not saying what I'm about to say. I don't mean it as it's perfect by any means, but I do think it gets back to something I said earlier. Sports tend to be a space-making phenomenon in the sense that before society fully integrates, the baseball team will integrate, right? And then things tend to follow. The same thing with certain sports. And I will say that for black athletes, there were the pioneers who were accepted in, but then had to the racial slurs, which still occur, right? But the overwhelming kind of racial slurs and non-acceptance. And then there's the second wave of being taken seriously. So if we're talking about the jockeys, right, I'm sure the original is very hard because culturally speaking, everyone just assumes those are still slaves on horses, right? But then slowly there's an integration. It's not an overnight kind of thing by any means, right? It's like sometimes I feel like when we talk about Jackie Robinson, it's like he broke the color barrier. Well, then he faced racial discrimination in those spaces like his entire life. I mean, he was a pioneer, right?
It's not like 42.
No. And so, but it's sports in and of themselves that makes the space so that then those things can take place and work themselves out. And again, they're all still imperfect. But I don't know of any other space or domains that we have in our society that, work the same way that sports kind of do in that way.
I think, music, I think.
Yeah.
And you mentioned minstrelsy, of course, black performers in the 40s and 50s knew how to do the minstrel show because that's what a lot of them had come up doing, right?
Yeah.
When minstrelsy passed from white people pretending to be black to black people pretending to be white people's idea of what black people are. People were very practiced. Entertainers were very, very practiced at delivering this product. But they also changed things, right? And it was slow and uneven, but it did happen. So these still slowly, unevenly, right? So these jockeys, right? These athletes knew that they looked like the little garden decorations, right? And that's why they were tolerated.
Yeah.
But they were also athletes, and they were also very powerful, and they didn't run. They didn't race to be decorations, right? They raced to win. So I think that's how change happens, right? One kind of audience brings a set of perceptions to something that are completely different from what those who are performing or performing their excellence are thinking and doing, and then sometimes that rubs off.
I think slow and uneven is a perfect way to say it. And do we have online questions?
Yeah, we have a couple of them.
Oh, great. I just remembered, and I was going to try to segue. Perfect.
Sure. First one. Do you have a book recommendation for a book that discusses the fine line between sporting events starting off with religious-like intentions but ending up in full-blown addiction?
Can you say it again?
What is a good book that discusses the fine line between sporting events that start off with religious-like intentions but end up in full-blown addiction?
Addictions.
You think they mean like fanaticism?
It must be.
Fanaticism as opposed to fandom?
Fans are fanatics. I don't know. What's the line on that?
There's several good books about soccer fandom in England, for example. I can't remember a title right now, but maybe somebody knows. And the hooliganism that attends these soccer or they call football games in England.
There's definitely, I actually don't know an exact answer to that. There are some really interesting examples of like basketball that starts off as kind of a specific religiously motivated sport that then untethers from that in some ways, right?
Yeah.
And many of the Southern football teams, the schools like Vanderbilt had a religious tie, I think, to the Methodist Church.
Yep.
And then the Methodist board wanted to eliminate football because it was absolutely so violent and horrendous. And the school voted to disconnect themselves from the Methodist Church and keep football. And so there are some religiously inspired kind of innovations around sport that most of us don't know the history of those things anymore.
Yeah.
Victoria?
I was just going to add, there's a good book about Italian soccer fandom that might fall within
Yeah.
this description. It's called Winning at All Costs, and it's by John Foote, which What a great name.
Yeah.
Winning at All Costs by John Foote.
Foot.
I'm saying it in the mic so they can hear.
Right. Yep.
Good recommendations on books, perhaps for a book yet to be written. So, second question, this gets at the economic sort of side of things. Does anyone on the panel have any thoughts on the John Fisher and Oakland Athletics situation? Should there be a certain level of high regulation in these matters allowed to So, and I'll try to paraphrase the second part. Should there be a higher level of regulation in these matters, or should the free market supersede any civic implications? See also, the Seattle Supersonics,
Yeah.
the Montreal Expos, etc.
I think free market forces are pretty sacred to the owners of these various teams, and I don't see them trying to rein in that tendency to follow the dollar. I just these are not socialists doing things for the good of. Well, I mean, look at the St. Louis Rams, right? The city builds them a big new stadium. They decide they don't want to be in St. Louis anymore, so they go to Los Angeles and build a $5 billion stadium or something like that. I don't think there's anywhere you're going to rein in those market forces among the owners.
I think Professor Balmer is exactly right that I think the finances and economics drive so much of what's going on. But I think the question itself gets at, should this take place? Because it gets back to, you're taking something away from these people, right? That is theirs, right? And we have to figure out what theirs means in the possession. But I think it, this does get to like, no, this is our team, and what are we going to do without them kind of idea. Yeah, I think it brings up some really rich questions to think about, that disconnect that takes place when something like this. For the Seattle Supersonics, I think is a great example.
Yeah.
They still despise the fact that they don't have a basketball team.
Right. And the owners leverage this. I mean, they hold these communities hostage, to build new stadiums and infrastructure. One of the issues I try to address in my course on sports and religion is the ethics of taxpayers paying for sporting arenas and stadiums. And to me, the most horrific example is Minneapolis. And I just discovered this when I was up there kind of walking around the city. The University of Minnesota built a $350 million new stadium. And just over a mile away, the Vikings decided that they needed a $1 billion stadium, and the taxpayers put the bill for this, with the threat that the Vikings were going to leave and go to, I don't know, Louisville or someplace. And probably not Louisville.
I don't think.
Also, a reminder that there are so many elements of, particularly in the major four sports, which we've been talking about, that are distinctively American. This doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. Where owners are able to leverage the threat of moving to another city unless taxpayers build this thing for me. Right. That doesn't exist anywhere else. And there's other dimensions of our major sports that are like your book speaks to, like the historical context around the origins of the emergence of these modern sports forms in the United States that are part of the project of American exceptionalism. Right. But if we're thinking about serving community, or the purpose and mission at the heart of the enterprise, like those sports clubs in other countries are very much about serving community and place like supporters. They use different language also. Supporters at the heart of the enterprise, and the players know to talk about the supporters being the heart of the club, and that you're a member of the club in order to be able to buy tickets to the team. So I think part of the framing around Americans' relationships with sports is this long history of isolationism, sporting isolationism, and how it's starting to come to an end. And maybe that will, and so many of the owners of U.S. teams are buying into European soccer
Yeah.
now, that maybe one of the positive outcomes of all of this kind of entry into the global sports world is to stop these bad behaviors and practices. I doubt it, right?
I mean, the counterexample in the U.S. is the Green Bay Packers, right? Are they still kind of locally owned, co-op?
They are.
Yeah.
So they're
you can buy shares.
Yeah, I mean, they're the one kind of counterexample that, they are paying for the stadium, but they own the team, right? Versus paying for the stadium and then giving it away to another owner. And so, I think they're an example that someone could model after if a community could ever somehow get together and build something like that.
Exception that proves the rule, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
Got something else for us?
Oh, I was going to say, it looks like we're just about at time. Does someone have a very quick question? Yes.
Hi, sorry, this is about that study with the skateboarders and
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
So was there a difference to those who answered what the relations between religion, what they were experiencing, if they were religious and they had experience with religion, or so they didn't have that upbringing, or they weren't currently religious? Was that a difference at all?
Yeah, so the skateboarders, we didn't ask their personal religious identity because I was just afraid they would just skate off and never talk to me again. I mean, the pickleball players, we actually asked them at the end of the survey, and one of the interesting things I found in the survey was, one of the questions was, in your life, in your daily life, do you feel like you give more time to your religious devotion or your pickleball playing? And it was 80-something% admitted to their pickleball playing. And I thought that was actually fascinating. But there really wasn't a distinction in how people described it. No one seemed to like that question. Do you think of it as spiritual or religious? Whether they were religious or not, everybody the responses are hilarious. And I've given a presentation on it. And so I'm always I don't want to ask that question to people because it seems to be so off-putting. Or I save it to the very end and I'm like, oh yeah, you hate it? Okay, we'll leave, right? Kind of deal. Yeah. It's a good way to wrap up. Yeah.
And on that note, we will wrap up. Victoria, do you want to close us out, or?
No.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking our wonderful guests. For gathering us, and Curtis and the Humanities Institute for hosting us.
Yeah, and thanks for attending and for everyone online. Thanks so much. This is great.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Yeah.